A very good morning to one and all. So today we are having an interesting presentation about incorporating a company and doing business in Canada. So we divided the presentation into two parts. The first part we talk about how the incorporation procedure works, and in the second part we'll be talking about having a property there, trademark registrations, and how does practical business working take place in Canada for foreigners. I would like to give credits for this research and this presentation for Mr. Anand and Krishna. You're doing a good job. Thank you. Certain ledgers used in the presentation. CAD represents Canadian dollars. CCPC represents Canadian Controlled Private Corporation. CIPO represents Canadian Intellectual Property Office. GST is Goods and Services Tax. HST is Harmonized Sales Tax. The scheme of presentation that we're going to follow is we understand the overview of Canada, some introduction to how companies are being set up, procedures for company setup and its regulations governing them. And part two will be discussing about registering property, building warehouse and doing business practically, trademark registration and trading across borders, certain tax laws and statistics. An overview of Canada. As we all know, Canada is a country in the northern part of North America, extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific and northward into the Atlantic Ocean into the Arctic Ocean. Canada is placed at third position for the ease of doing business. So we have seen in the previous presentations, Singapore is ranked as number 2 in terms of ease in doing business, and Canada is in the third position. It consists of 10 provinces and 3 territories spanning across 9.98 million square kilometers, making it the second largest country by total area. So below you can see all the highlighted provinces which is spanning across Canada. So Canada is an open country when it comes to those who want to set up businesses irrespective of nationalities. Foreign investors who would want to open Canadian companies as non-residents have several options to set up companies in multiple provinces in Canada, which you're going to understand in the next few slides. They can set up companies and manage them from abroad or by moving to Canada. So once the company is set up, they can even apply for permits, and based on the strengths of the company which is being set up, they are also issued permits to come into Canada. And in this webinar, our focus will be on foreign companies and corporations intending to do business in Canada. So now let's look into the company registration and the setup procedures and the documentation and the timelines involved for different provinces, as well as differentiation between a permanent resident, a business immigrant, a citizen, and a foreigner in doing business in Canada. So understanding the business formation, first of all, let's look into the formation by a Canadian citizen or a business immigrant who comes into Canada using an immigrant visa. So for a Canadian citizen, it's quite straightforward for setting up a business, where he can start a business with his Canadian address by acquiring provincial or federal registration. A company can also be formed by a business immigrant by applying for Visit to Canada procedure, whereby the Citizenship and Immigration Canada Department provides 2 types of business immigration programs, namely the Startup Visa program and the program for self-employed persons. An individual, on satisfying the specified condition laid out by the Citizenship and the Immigration Canada procedures relating to language requirements, education, can choose either of the above programs, be it startup program or the program for self-employed. Factors affecting an application to visit Canada as a semi-employed person include education, age, adaptability, and language abilities. And the most important criteria is the applicant must be able to listen, speak, read, and write English or French proficiently for him to be eligible to apply for this program. And that is done by various online tests, and based on the results of the test is taken into consideration for providing these schemes to business immigrants from abroad. Now let's look into the formation by non-Canadian citizen or a non-immigrant. A company can be also formed with a Canadian having a Canadian address. However, there is a requirement that at least 25% of the directors should be resident in Canada. If there are fewer than 4 directors, then at least 1 director must be resident in Canada. Each province has different residency requirement, and some provinces do not impose residency requirement for directors. So an investor incorporating a company in Canada should choose a province accordingly. And for a requirement for a person to be a director, he should be at least 18 years of age. There should be no bankruptcy proceedings, no criminal history, and a minimum of 25% who must be a Canadian. So basically for a foreigner to set up, he can set it up in Canada, but at least 25% of the directors of the company should be Canadian citizens and must have a residency in Canada. Each province has its own rules and regulation in terms of address. For instance, the province of British Columbia, which has the most flexible rules regarding non-resident businesses, requires only a physical address and a viable work permit. So you don't need to have a residency address for a Canadian or a Canadian director to be part of the company's incorporation. The person starting such businesses must submit an application for review to the Investment Review Board division before making the investment. The application form needs to be submitted with complete KYC documents of the promoters as well as the other directors forming part of the company. The division, within a period of 45 days, will determine whether the investment should be approved, and on approval is granted, the company can be incorporated in British Columbia. There are also certain rules where if a company wants to be having its office registration in, let's example, take Ontario, but in Ontario, the company requires to have a minimum of 25% of the directors who are Canadians. In this cases, a company can be formed in British Columbia where this regulation is not required, and a branch office can be set up in Ontario, whereby in the case of a branch, you also don't need to have a 25% shareholder or directorship by a local Canadian. Certain documents that are required for setting up the companies. The first is the Articles of Incorporation. These are the rules that will govern the company's directors and members. The Memorandum of Incorporation, which sets out the rules for the company's conduct. The Notice of Offices, which informs the government of the registered office of the company. And Notice of Directors, which is required for federal incorporation. So once these documents are ready, it should be submitted to the division for the purpose of approval, along with the KYC documents and the business profile, for it to get the registration of the company process moving ahead. So deciding how you want to name your company, a company selects the name which does not include a misrepresentation of the business. Completing the Articles of Incorporation, which is the rules and regulation which govern the conduct of the company. Establishing the initial registered office address and its first board of directors, whereby an indication of the registered office, which can be taken on rent or it could be a shared office address, but a permanent address is required, and making sure the eligibility requirements of all the directors are met, which is, they should not have any legal cases against them, and they should never be disqualified as a director. They should be of minimum 18 years of age. Filling the appropriate forms and paying the fees, which can be also done online, and the processing of application takes place. Corporations Canada will make sure the Articles of Incorporation have been properly completed and that the proposed name is acceptable. There are two broad criteria of incorporation of company in Canada. One is called as a provincial incorporation. The other one is called as a federal incorporation. Now let's look into the difference between the two. A business can be incorporated in a single Canadian territory or province, which is coming under the provincial incorporation, and each provincial incorporation is a standalone process. The country is separated into 10 provinces and 3 territories. Once incorporated in one of the areas, the company's name is secured and it can also conduct business in that sector. However, to carry out business in another province, registration with the other provincial authority is required. So it is not like you can set up one company in one province and do businesses in all the other 10 provinces. There is another criteria of incorporation which is coming under the category of federal incorporation, where federal incorporation of that business means that you'll be able to do business across all sectors and provinces in Canada under the same business name, even if some other company is already using a similar name in some province or territory. And obviously in this case, the rules and regulations and the setup procedure, timelines, the requirements are going to be on the higher side. In the upcoming slides, we'll have a look at the difference between the two provincial and federal incorporation procedures as well as their rules governing them. Here is a quick overview. So let us make a comparison between federal and provincial incorporation, and for provincial we'll take the provincial of Ontario. So the government fees for federal is 200 Canadian dollars, whereas for a provincial corporation it works out to $360. Mandatory filing for the case of federal, when it comes to compliance, it's slightly on the higher side because you can do business in all the provinces. It's required to complete the annual returns every year in order to stay active. And if a federal corporation misses two of these filings, the corporation will be dissolved by the federal government. However, in the case of provincial corporations, there is no such mandatory annual filing for the Ontario corporation. There is only one mandatory filing, which is called as the initial notice, and is due within 60 days of incorporating the company, which has to be done online as well. For name protection, federal corporations have a higher level of name protection as their name is protected at a federal level. So with that single name, they could do business in all the provinces. However, an Ontario corporation will have name protection only within the province. So a company which is incorporated in Ontario for in a particular name, any other company which forms in any of the other provinces can use the same name and start up as well. But in the case of federal, it's not possible because the name is protected at a federal level. Coming to processing time, as a name approval process is more rigorous for federal corporation, this increases the processing time to 1 to 2 business days to complete incorporation. However, in the case of Ontario, a simple form is filled up electronically and the registration is done on the spot on the desktop itself. Extra provincial registration for federal corporations is required to register the corporation within each province where operation is carried out. So though it is federal, they will have to go and register themselves that they are a federal corporation in each of the provinces where they wish their business operation to be carried out. And Ontario corporation is able to register extra provincially if business operation expands the operation to other provinces. So setting up an overseas company. So in the case of overseas company opening a branch office, to open a branch office, the foreign corporation must make an application for registration as an extra provincial or foreign corporation in each province in which the business intend to operate. But however, in the case of subsidiary, is a Canadian corporation whose shares are held by the foreign parent company. A subsidiary can be incorporated, either it could be provincial or it could be federal, and compared with a branch office, incorporating a subsidiary gives the parent company limited liability from the actions of the subsidiary. So a foreign company could also set up a branch office which takes care of an extra provincial setup which has to be done. If it's going to be a subsidiary, it can either be a federal or it can be provincial, which follows the same rules and regulations as we discussed in the previous slides, but it becomes a subsidiary formed either provincially or federally depending on how the business activities has to be carried out by the subsidiary in Canada. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. In the part 2 of this presentation, we'll be discussing more about trademark registration, buying properties and doing business and managing construction, and how Canada as a country invites foreign direct investment into the country for the purpose of having properties as well as business properties and trademark registrations and the tax rates which the country is implied for business incomes. Thank you. I'll look forward to meet you in yet another interesting presentation.